Bryce Collins didn't choose Sellers Creek for its charm, or for the quiet, oak-lined streets, or even for the proximity to the city courthouse. He chose it because it was statistically uneventful. That's what he told himself as he pulled into the narrow driveway of his new home on the first day of March, in a 4-door government-leased sedan with an empty passenger seat and a glove compartment stacked with compliance forms. A man like Bryce didn't do nostalgia, and sentiment wasn't a luxury he entertained. But even he couldn't ignore the faint pulse of irony when he stepped out of the car and found himself once again standing in the same county where he grew up, breathing in the scent of red clay and pine like a bad memory that hadn't aged. 20 years earlier, he'd left Sellers Creek with a scholarship in one hand and a box of unfinished arguments in the other. Now, as a recently appointed state property commissioner, he returned not as a native son, but as the man whose signature could kill or resurrect whole plots of land with the stroke of a pen. The house itself was nothing remarkable. 1-story, neutral siding, a carport that leaned just enough to irritate an engineer but not enough to qualify as unsafe, and a patchy lawn that wore the scars of previous tenants. Bryce had seen the listing in a routine internal audit. A foreclosed property with 0 bids, dumped in a municipal trust after a convoluted legal dispute over inheritance and boundary lines. He acquired it quietly through a state employee exception program, not because he needed it, but because it was clean. Clean in the sense that no one would think twice about him being there. He didn't want the neighbors to know who he was, and he especially didn't want to be that guy from the Capitol who lived 2 blocks down. Bryce wasn't a politician. He was a systems man. Rules, procedure, statute, and nothing made people more uncomfortable than rules in the flesh. At first, everything went as expected. He moved in with minimal furniture. 1 bed, 1 desk, 1 chair, a French press, and resumed his remote work schedule with the kind of precision that made him almost invisible. He walked in the evenings, nodded politely at dog-walking neighbors, kept his lawn short, and never hosted visitors. On Sundays, he drove to an independent laundromat in the next county over, where no one asked questions and the machines didn't play music. Bryce kept a paper log of neighborhood activity, not for surveillance, but out of habit. Car makes, recycling days, porch lights that stayed on too late. He saw it as a form of participation, a way to understand the rhythm of his surroundings without actually having to engage with them. It was a rhythm that started to shift about 3 weeks in. The first anomaly was subtle. A white sedan parked across the street for 2 consecutive nights, its driver smoking through a cracked window. Then it vanished. A week later, Bryce received an Amazon package he hadn't ordered, a bathroom shelf in faux walnut, with no return label. He chalked it up to a missed delivery and dropped it at the nearest depot. On the 5th week, a flyer appeared in his mailbox offering discounted cleaning services for temporary renters, with the name Creek Stay Managed Homes, printed in small bold letters on the bottom corner. That got his attention. He wasn't renting, and the name wasn't on any vendor list for the county. He wouldn't have investigated further if not for what happened on the first Thursday in May, a humid day where the air tasted like wet stone and the street was unusually quiet. Bryce returned from a meeting in town, turned the corner onto Pine Knot Lane, and saw 2 people, a man and a woman in their 30s, standing on his porch with suitcases at their feet. They looked irritated. The woman was scrolling through her phone while the man knocked with the kind of entitlement that comes from a confirmation email. Bryce parked the car slowly, stepped out, and locked eyes with them across the yard. Before he could speak, the woman smiled, waved, and said, "Hi, sorry we're early. The code didn't work. We texted the host." Bryce's spine locked in place. "Host?" he asked calmly. "Yeah. Karen said we could drop bags early. She manages the property, right? This is 84 Pine Knot?" the man added, already glancing at his phone. "It's on Staywell, 3 bedrooms, quiet professional space, check-in 3 p.m. You're the owner?" Bryce's first instinct was not rage, but calculation. He asked for their reservation, which they handed over readily. A full week booked under the listing name Serenity Creek Bungalow, hosted by K. Elridge. The photos were recent, frighteningly so. His rug, his silverware, the shelf from the misdelivered package mounted in the bathroom. There was even a shot of the backyard fence, complete with the slight bend he hadn't fixed yet. Bryce dismissed the couple with practiced ease, promised them a refund, and waited until their rideshare drove off before unlocking his front door with the sensation of a fuse catching flame somewhere beneath his ribs. Inside, nothing was missing, but everything felt touched. A drawer had been rearranged. The blinds in the guest room were pulled halfway instead of all the way down. His backup house key, the one he kept behind a loose brick in the crawl space, was gone. He changed the locks that evening and spent most of the night staring at zoning databases and property records. The next morning, a bright envelope appeared wedged into the screen door. Not mailed, hand-delivered. No return address, but the watermark was familiar. The stylized oak leaf of the Sellers Creek Neighborhood Board. Bryce opened it slowly, feeling the dull throb of irritation bloom into something darker. The letter began with an alarmingly informal tone. Dear resident, due to lack of active occupancy status, your property has been designated for temporary accommodation under the Unified Utilization Policy, effective April 10th. There was no signature, just a stamped name, Karen Elridge, Residential Coordination, Liaison. Bryce read the letter 3 times. Then once more aloud, just to be sure the absurdity wasn't imagined. Unified Utilization Policy. A phrase that sounded official but rang with the cheap cadence of made-up governance. He checked the county land use ordinances. Nothing. He checked the state legislative database. Still nothing. The phrase didn't exist. He typed it into a search engine and found only one result. A defunct website called creekstayhousing.org, which redirected to a blank page. The realization hit slowly, not like a punch, but like a slow, methodical rapping of chains. Someone had listed his home for rent, without consent, with photos taken from inside. Someone had entered his house, installed a shelf, rearranged his belongings, and created a false rental profile tied to a ghost management company run by a woman who had no legal authority over his property. And worst of all, he had been selected not by accident, but because of the one thing no one else in the neighborhood knew, that he wouldn't overreact. Bryce Collins wasn't just a homeowner. He was the legal custodian of the property law for the entire state, which made what happened next not just illegal, but a direct insult to everything he was hired to protect. And if Karen Elridge thought she could weaponize fake policy, commandeer homes under the guise of local initiative, and profit off unsuspecting residents, then she had just made the worst administrative decision of her life. What she didn't know was that Bryce had already opened a quiet file under her name, tagged it under private asset misrepresentation, and marked it for escalation. He wasn't going to knock on her door or leave notes on her porch. He wasn't going to call the police. He wasn't even going to confront her directly. Not yet. Instead, Bryce was going to do what he did best. He was going to follow the rules, and he was going to make sure she choked on every single one. The next morning began with rain. Not the dramatic, cinematic kind that slams against windows and justifies slow-motion epiphanies, but the dull, persistent drizzle that clings to everything and makes even the most decisive man hesitate before stepping outside. Bryce stood barefoot in the kitchen, his second cup of coffee cooling on the counter, eyes fixed on the open letter from the Sellers Creek Neighborhood Board. The phrase, Unified Utilization Policy, stared back at him like a taunt. It didn't matter how many times he'd verified the term through every legal and regulatory system at his disposal, it didn't exist. Not in statute, not in local bylaws, not in any emergency ordinance archive, not even in the digital landfill of obscure policy drafts filed and forgotten by municipalities desperate for relevance. This wasn't a misinterpretation of a gray area regulation. This was fiction. Invented authority written on letterhead and slipped onto his property like it belonged there. It took Bryce less than an hour to draft a formal inquiry. He addressed it not just to the board, but to the county clerk's office and a secondary recipient in the Attorney General's Regulatory Division. It was direct but dispassionate, outlining the presence of false administrative documentation and the unauthorized usage of his private residence under fabricated policy. He attached scanned copies of the letter, screenshots from the rental listing, metadata timestamps from the photos, and a log of the incident with the would-be renters. The language he used wasn't accusatory. It was surgical. Bryce understood the value of precision. It wasn't about emotion. It was about exposing fault lines. By noon, he had received an automated response from the clerk's office confirming receipt. The AG's office didn't respond, but he hadn't expected them to. He sent no letter to Karen herself. Instead, he closed his laptop and took a walk. The first real walk he'd taken through the neighborhood since moving in. Not a quiet observational stroll like before, but a deliberate perimeter sweep. He passed 8 houses, 4 of them with identical lawn signs that read, "This home proudly participates in community rebalance." The phrase wasn't threatening on its face, but it echoed the same manufactured legitimacy as the unified utilization policy. The signs were sleek. Pre-printed, weather-laminated, and staked professionally, not made by volunteers or eager residents. Bryce noted every address. On the corner of Pine Knot and Winstead, he saw a small kiosk. New, apparently installed over the weekend, featuring pamphlets that matched the aesthetic of the flyer he'd received earlier. Creek Stay. Community harmony through efficient occupancy. He took one, folded it into quarters, and slipped it into his jacket. Inside were glossy spreads about rotational housing, sustainable lot fluidity, and adaptive space stewardship, none of which meant anything. There were no names, no phone numbers, no legal disclaimers, but the tone was unmistakable. This was not a suggestion. It was a program, quietly enforced, and Bryce had stumbled right into its machinery. That same afternoon, a maintenance truck pulled into his driveway without warning. 2 men in uniforms bearing a simple tree logo emblem stepped out and began unloading tools. Bryce opened the door before they could reach the porch. One of them, younger, polite, smiled and said they were here for the utility compliance upgrade. Bryce asked for paperwork. They had none. When he pressed further, the older man shrugged and mumbled something about mandatory inspections for provisional dwellings. Bryce didn't raise his voice. He simply stepped forward and said flatly, "This isn't a provisional dwelling. It's my permanent home. You're trespassing. Please leave the property." They hesitated, but eventually packed up and drove off. 2 hours later, a warning notice appeared in his mailbox. Not mailed, but hand-delivered, again without a return address. This one accused him of obstruction of municipal maintenance protocols. The document bore no legal insignia, only the repeated crest of the tree logo, the same one from the maintenance truck, and the pamphlets. At the bottom, in small print, "Failure to cooperate may result in suspension of local access amenities." Bryce read that line twice. Local access amenities. They couldn't have been more vague if they tried. That night, he initiated a deep property record pull through the state's internal registry system, something most homeowners didn't have access to without formal request. The record on his parcel was clean. No lines, no zoning challenges, no easements, and most critically, no temporary designations. Whatever Karen and her associates were doing, they weren't doing it through legal means. They were constructing a parallel system of control, soft enough to avoid lawsuits, aggressive enough to reshape behavior, and ambiguous enough to disorient anyone who questioned it. It wasn't about one house. It was about redefining ownership without changing the law. The next day, the doorbell rang at 9:15 a.m. Bryce opened it to find a woman in a pale green windbreaker holding a clipboard. She introduced herself as Daphne from Sellers Creek Resident Access Logistics. Her tone was measured but friendly in a rehearsed way, like someone who had delivered this exact speech several dozen times already. She informed him that his property had been temporarily designated for light rotation, and that while the status was non-binding, his cooperation would greatly ease community tension. Bryce asked her for identification. She offered a laminated badge with no photo and no agency seal. When he inquired about the legal basis for the designation, she smiled and said, "We follow internal alignment protocols approved by the Participation Council." If you'd like to escalate concerns, you're welcome to join the Wednesday open feedback session at the Neighborhood Commons. Bryce asked if refusal to participate would result in punitive action. Daphne didn't flinch. "We always strive for voluntary harmony," she said, "but misalignment can create process delays and perception complications for all involved." Bryce thanked her and closed the door. He didn't speak to anyone else that day. Instead, he prepared a formal statement of status correction, a document used internally to contest false occupancy classifications. He knew it wouldn't have any direct effect in this context, since no legitimate authority had made the designation, but the point wasn't to correct a record. The point was to establish a trail, one that could be referenced later if litigation became necessary. He filed the document with 3 agencies, BCC'd his own State Department, and logged every point of contact he had encountered since the renters arrived: the maintenance truck, the pamphlet stand, the flyers, the false inspection, the doorstep, notice, and now Daphne with her clipboard and euphemisms. By day's end, his email inbox contained a new notice. Not from the board or any known entity, but from an anonymous address using the domain harmonyrotation.info. It contained no greeting, no signature, only a single sentence. "You're not making this easy for yourself." Bryce stared at the screen, jaw tight, fingers still on the keyboard. He'd spent most of his professional life unraveling schemes hidden behind boilerplate language and misused authority. But this was something else. It wasn't a scam. It was an ecosystem, a closed loop designed to consume hesitation and manufacture consent through fatigue. Most people would fold. Most people had. That's why it was working. But Bryce wasn't most people, and they didn't know who they were playing with yet. Not even close. It began to shift on a Wednesday, the kind of slow but irrevocable tilt in atmosphere that most people wouldn't recognize until it had already taken root. But Bryce Collins noticed it immediately. It started with a hum. Low, constant, not quite mechanical, but persistent enough to be heard beneath the walls. He checked the utilities, walked the perimeter, inspected the crawl space, but the sound wasn't coming from inside his property. It was external, ambient, like the faint buzz of a machine that had been installed somewhere nearby but deliberately hidden. He spent the next 2 hours cataloging possible sources: nearby HVACs, neighbor lawn equipment, even an underground transformer box, but the rhythm didn't match anything standard. It wasn't loud enough to cause disturbance, but it was there, and it didn't stop. That same afternoon, the smart meter on the side of his house blinked irregularly, flashing a diagnostic error he hadn't seen before. He submitted a report to the energy company, but the service response was curious. The technician confirmed that the equipment had been recently adjusted under residential harmonization protocol, a phrase Bryce had never encountered in any utility. Contract. When pressed for clarification, the rep stammered, claimed it was part of localized grid optimization, and then quickly referred him to the neighborhood board, an absurd deflection that confirmed once again that something unofficial was happening. Under the veil of bureaucratic gibberish. Later that evening, a pair of LED floodlights were installed on the easement between his house and the neighbors. They hadn't been there the day before. The angle of the lights was strange, angled just enough to spill onto his kitchen window but not directly shine into the neighbor's property. Bryce approached the neighbor to inquire politely, but the man, who barely cracked the door, said, "Wasn't me. They were put in by Karen's people. Said it was for security." Bryce didn't press further, not because he was intimidated, but because he already recognized the strategy. It was a method of pressure through friction, physical, environmental manipulation designed to grind down tolerance without breaching legality, change the atmosphere just enough, and eventually even the most stubborn resident would start questioning their own stability. But Bryce wasn't a man who bent under pressure. He was a man who documented it. By midnight, he had filed 3 internal reports to state oversight offices, including a formal complaint citing environmental manipulation via unauthorized installations. He documented every interaction, photographed the new lighting, annotated the power line routes, and time-stamped everything. The next morning, the garbage truck skipped his house. The bins were full, tagged correctly and placed curbside by the book, but the truck passed without slowing. He waved it down from the driveway, but the driver only shrugged, said the route had been altered. When Bryce called sanitation services, they told him the board had submitted a temporary suspension of residential sanitation access due to occupancy uncertainty. The phrase hit like a cold slap. Occupancy uncertainty. It was an invented term, but its intention was clear. Without confirming his participation in their program, he was being gradually unhooked from essential services. Bryce, who understood the law better than most lawyers, knew that denying sanitation service based on fabricated occupancy status was a violation of both municipal code and environmental policy. He forwarded the service denial to the Regional Compliance Division, adding yet another item to the growing archive of indirect attacks. 2 nights later, a silver SUV parked at the end of his driveway. It sat there idling for 23 minutes. No one exited. Bryce watched from his living room, blinds partially drawn, not moving. The license plate was partially obscured by mud, the rear window tinted darker than legal limit. Eventually, the car pulled away, slow and silent. He made no move to confront them. He simply logged the event, checked the security feed, and transferred the footage to his encrypted drive. Then, for the first time since moving into Sellers Creek, he called someone. Not a neighbor, not a colleague, but a federal liaison contact embedded in a task group dealing with informal governance structures. The man on the other end of the line didn't seem surprised. "You're not the first to report something like this," he said quietly, "but you're the first who knows how to respond properly." The next escalation came through paper. A certified envelope arrived with no sender's name, only a stamped seal bearing the now familiar oak leaf crest of the neighborhood board. Inside was a 3-page notice of residential misalignment, claiming that due to continued non-participation in community rotation schedules and non-response to cooperative integration surveys, Bryce's property was now flagged for reassessment under Section 9L of Adaptive Living Bylaws. This, of course, was nonsense. Section 9L didn't exist. Adaptive Living Bylaws were not a real thing. But the tone of the letter was firm, commanding, and clearly designed to read like law to the average person. The final page listed a schedule. 3 upcoming dates when property survey specialists would arrive to reaffirm spatial compliance. Bryce's jaw tightened. They were planning to send people onto his property. Again. He responded the same day with a cease and desist letter drafted under the color of law, citing trespass codes and unauthorized surveying, and attached an electronic version of his property deed, zoning confirmations, and relevant statutes from both county and state records. He mailed 1 copy, emailed another, and physically delivered a third to the office where Karen allegedly worked, a drab 2-room space inside a converted florist shop on the edge of town. No one answered when he knocked, but he slid the envelope through the door slot and recorded the delivery. 2 days later, the floodlights were upgraded. Not just brighter, but now motion-activated, with a low-grade hum that triggered when he crossed his own yard. At night, they snapped on with predatory precision. The sidewalk began to crack from subtle overwatering. Someone had rerouted the community irrigation line. Weeds appeared overnight in his flower beds. Fast, invasive species not native to the area. Bryce recognized the signs. They were waging a war of erosion. Make the home less livable, the environment more hostile, until even someone like him would consider vacating or agreeing to a temporary relocation. But Bryce didn't vacate. He retaliated legally. He submitted a petition to the state's Property Fraud Investigation Unit, not as a victim, but as a regulatory officer citing possible violations of land use ethics. He attached every document, every time-stamped image, and every unexplained service disruption. He didn't accuse. He exposed. He included a clause requesting anonymized third-party review, knowing full well that his position could be used against him if he appeared retaliatory. He wasn't building a case for revenge. He was constructing a wall they couldn't scale. That weekend, Karen finally made an appearance. It was a casual Saturday morning. Bryce was trimming the hedges, wearing gloves and an old flannel shirt, when she walked up the drive like she owned the concrete. Her posture was relaxed but calculated, her sunglasses reflective, her tone bright. "Good morning, Mr. Collins," she chirped. "We haven't had a chance to meet formally. I'm Karen Elridge. I'm sure you've seen my name on a few of our community notices." Bryce nodded once, neutral. She continued, "I wanted to touch base. There's been a little confusion, I hear, regarding your participation status in the rotation program. Totally understandable. We've had a few growing pains lately, but it's important, especially for newcomers, to embrace the model. It really does help us maintain balance." She smiled, too wide. "If you're not ready to host short-term visitors, we have other roles available. Supply coordination, resource scheduling. We're flexible." Bryce didn't move. He simply asked, "Are you aware of how many municipal codes you violated in the last 30 days? Karen's smile didn't falter, but her voice cooled. "I think you misunderstand. These aren't city programs. They're community-based, independent, self-regulating. We don't need bureaucracy to do what's right for our neighborhood." Bryce let the silence hang. Then he said evenly, "You entered my home. Without consent. You rented it, installed equipment, distributed false documentation. I have logs, photos, and a federal liaison reading every word of this conversation as we speak." Karen's face twitched, only slightly, then hardened. She took a step back and tilted her head. "Well," she said, "it seems like you've made your choice." She turned and walked away. Bryce stood still until she disappeared around the bend. That night, every light in his house flickered once, off, then on, at precisely 2 a.m. And that was when he knew. The real fight had only just begun. It was the 4th week of what Bryce had begun calling, in his private notes, the Operation Displacement Campaign, a term that, while perhaps too formal for some, captured the tone and structure of what was happening to him with frightening accuracy. He had seen policies bent and rewritten to fit private agendas during his tenure as a commissioner, but this was something else entirely. This wasn't a dispute over land value or easements or zoning variances. This was an engineered erosion of ownership rights, waged through silence, implication, and fabricated community doctrine. And it was becoming more brazen with each passing day. The air felt charged, almost rehearsed, as if the neighborhood itself had slipped into a script from which only he had deviated. There were no more pamphlets, no more polite suggestions or clipboard visits. Instead, there was a quiet but coordinated campaign of displacement, unacknowledged but persistent, carried out by actors who wore the language of collaboration like a second skin. Bryce's routines had shifted accordingly. He stopped walking the perimeter and instead used a shortwave scanner to monitor nearby frequencies. He adjusted his lighting patterns and routed the smart thermostat through a secure line. He changed his email, installed physical blinds instead of motorized ones, and upgraded his interior locks to a system normally reserved for government offices. He wasn't panicking. He was preparing. The next phase was inevitable, and he intended to be ready. The trigger came in the form of a formal envelope from the Department of Administrative Review, stamped and sealed, with no return address but postmarked from the state capital. It looked official. It felt official. But Bryce had never heard of the issuing department, and he had worked in that building for 6 years. Inside was a form, neatly laid out, coded with numeric fields and checkboxes, requesting that he confirm his intent to continue possession of Parcel 84 PK under Contingency Clause 7F. The language was crafted to confuse, vague enough to imply consequences, specific enough to resemble legality. It was the first document that felt as though someone had attempted to imitate internal state language. That meant whoever was behind this wasn't just improvising. They were evolving. That same day, Bryce received a call, not from an alias, not from a private number, but from his colleague at the Registry of Land Use Integrity. The voice on the other end, a calm, seasoned auditor named Elaine, spoke in a lower register than usual. "Bryce," she said, "your parcel was flagged in a back-end system last night. Someone issued a request to initiate transitional stewardship. That's not a standard protocol. It's not even a recognized request type, but it was entered into the queue under your regional code. The ID used to access the system matches a third-tier municipal login from your county, not state level. Local?" She paused, and Bryce felt the implication settle. "You have internal interference." He thanked her without ceremony and ended the call. Then he sat in silence for a moment, letting the weight of that confirmation settle into place. It was no longer a suspicion. It was now confirmed. Someone within the local administrative ecosystem was using institutional pathways to create the illusion of public policy where none existed, all in service of a fabricated neighborhood agenda. And now, it had reached the state's own systems. The following morning, Bryce filed a formal integrity breach with the state. He didn't do it through email. He drove 2 counties over, walked into a secure administrative office, and submitted the documentation in person to a deputy auditor. He handed over every fake notice, every manipulated request, every forged policy reference and flagged credential. The deputy, a man who had clearly seen his share of internal corruption, reviewed the documents with rising eyebrows and a slow exhale. "You understand," he said, "this could trigger a full external audit of the entire regional land authority." Bryce didn't hesitate. "It needs to. Whatever's happening in Sellers Creek isn't just local. They're using residential policy as a weapon." That same night, the flickering started again. Only this time it wasn't confined to his house. 3 neighboring properties went dark for over 20 seconds. When the lights returned, only his remained flickering. Bryce reviewed the feed from his security system. 2 utility workers, unmarked uniforms, appeared on camera walking the rear utility path. One carried a handheld device, the other a small black case. They never approached his house directly, but lingered long enough to manipulate something off-frame, then left. Bryce isolated the footage and sent it to the same federal contact who had responded weeks earlier. He received a single reply an hour later. "They're escalating. Do not engage directly. We'll initiate a review under quiet protocol. Stay in place." Bryce didn't sleep that night. Not because he was afraid, but because he knew what came next. This was the pivot point, the place in every system where subtle pressure gave way to direct force. The objective now was not just to discourage him, it was to provoke him, make him act out, make him confront someone in public. make him file an emotional report that could later be dismissed as reactionary. But Bryce wasn't going to give them that. He wouldn't show teeth. He'd show the law. 2 days later, a knock came at the door at exactly 8 a.m. It wasn't Karen. It wasn't Daphne. It was a man in a slate-gray sport coat, clipboard under his arm, and a badge that looked just real enough to matter. He introduced himself as a compliance liaison for the Community Spatial Transition Office, another fictional entity. Bryce stepped aside, invited him in, offered a coffee. The man hesitated, clearly unsure of how to respond to civility. He declined the coffee, but entered. He began asking questions. Subtle, leading queries about occupancy rates, neighborhood cohesion, utility access. Bryce answered everything precisely, without offering anything unnecessary. He asked for the man's identification again, and when it was presented, he took a photo of it. The man didn't object. That was a mistake. An hour after he left, Bryce uploaded the image through the credential verification system at the Department of Regulatory Affairs. No match, no registration. The badge was counterfeit. That afternoon, 2 things happened in quick succession. First, the board posted a neighborhood-wide memo citing increased resistance from select property owners and announced the implementation of a compliance alignment phase. The language was ominous but empty. Second, a large white moving truck parked at the edge of Bryce's property and idled for over 30 minutes without unloading a single box. No driver exited. No paperwork was provided. When Bryce approached, the truck pulled away slowly. No plates, no markings. He returned to his porch, sat on the steps, and stared out at the street. He didn't need more evidence. He needed resolution. And he knew now, with complete certainty, someone would make a mistake. And when they did, he would bury them with their own policies. By the time the second escalation began, Bryce had already stopped pretending he was merely a resident. Whatever personal boundary he'd tried to maintain between himself and his professional identity had been methodically broken down by the steady, deliberate encroachment of the system now surrounding him. He no longer approached the situation with passive resistance or bureaucratic diligence. The gloves, so to speak, were off. He understood now that what he was dealing with wasn't a rogue property manager or a misguided neighborhood group. This was a well-structured, deeply embedded apparatus of local control masquerading as community stewardship, a hybrid between amateur governance and organized racketeering, engineered by people who had learned just enough of the language of administration to mimic it convincingly. He wasn't fighting miscommunication. He was fighting an ideology, one that weaponized neighborhood identity and property fluidity against anyone who refused to play by its rules. The 5th week opened with a sound. Not the faint buzzing or flickering he'd grown used to, but a sharp, percussive clang at 2:46 a.m., loud enough to shake the drywall and knock a picture frame off the hallway hook. Bryce sprang from bed, heart rate steady, instincts precise. The source wasn't inside. It came from the side gate. He moved quietly, barefoot, no lights. Through the narrow window above the kitchen sink, he saw a figure crouched near the gas line. The man wasn't wearing a uniform. He wasn't marked in any way, but he was holding tools, and his movements were calculated. Bryce activated the perimeter floodlights and stepped onto the porch, phone recording. Voice steady. "You're on private property. Identify yourself or leave immediately." The man didn't respond. Instead, he dropped the wrench and bolted down the side yard, disappearing into the trees that bordered the adjacent lot. Bryce didn't pursue. He called it in, directly to a contact at the Public Utility Security Division. The response was swift and quiet. Within hours, a black SUV arrived, unmarked, and 2 plainclothes investigators combed the area. They found scuff marks on the fence, fragments of plastic tubing, and fresh fingerprints on the gas valve. Bryce handed over the footage. There would be no official report, not yet. But a back-end case was opened. 3 days later, the retaliation began. It started with a letter, not from the board, but from the county assessor's office. The envelope looked authentic, the contents were detailed, but something was off. The property reassessment it described cited recent modifications, including an unauthorized secondary structure, expanded utility lines, and non-compliant fencing. All false. Bryce knew every inch of his property, and none of these alterations existed. He called the office. The clerk on the line, flustered and apologetic, claimed the inspection report had been submitted by certified neighborhood liaison, complete with time-stamped images and GPS data. Bryce requested a copy. When it arrived, he found himself staring at doctored photos. His backyard, altered digitally to show a shed that didn't exist, a satellite dish he never installed, and fencing that appeared taller than regulation height. The metadata on the images had been manipulated, but not well enough. He traced the signature on the submission form to a registered proxy used by the Sellers Creek board, signed, once again, by Karen Elridge. That same day, he received 2 citations taped to his door, one for landscape overgrowth, the other for failure to comply with noise ordinance limitations. Both were absurd. His lawn was trimmed weekly and he hadn't played music, hosted guests, or even run a vacuum outside of daylight hours. But the language of the citations was damning. Repeat violations may result in conditional access revocation. He knew what that meant. They weren't trying to fine him. They were building a dossier. Piece by piece, they were constructing a record, manufactured but official-looking, that could be used to justify further intervention. It was paper warfare, and it was escalating. The week wore on, and the pressure became more sophisticated. First, his internet service degraded. It didn't cut out completely. It staggered. Just enough packet loss to disrupt video calls, delay file uploads, and fracture real-time communication. He switched providers. The issue followed him. He ran diagnostics. The interference wasn't random, it was targeted. Then came the mail delays. Packages went missing. Letters arrived torn, some resealed poorly. A document from the auditor's office arrived 2 days late, crumpled and wet, despite having been marked confidential and urgent. The local postmaster claimed routing errors. Bryce logged it all. Then came the neighbors. Not the quiet ones, not the ones who avoided eye contact or whispered apologies in passing. These were different. New faces, suddenly present, unnaturally visible. They loitered at the end of his driveway, leaned against his mailbox, jogged past his windows repeatedly without breaking stride. One man, tall in his early 30s, passed by 6 times in a single hour, each time slowing just slightly as he neared the porch. Another, a woman with a stroller that never held a child, began walking the baby at exactly 90 p.m. every night, pausing near his garbage bins and staring too long at the motion sensor light. Bryce confronted no one. He recorded everything. And each night he sat at his desk, reviewing footage, annotating behavior, and expanding the archive. Then came the message. It wasn't a letter. It wasn't an email. It was a sticker, affixed to the side of his mailbox, printed in clear block letters. We remember non-participants. No attribution. No logo. Just black text on white adhesive. It peeled off easily, but the implication stuck harder than any glue. This wasn't about regulations anymore. This was ideological. Bryce had become an enemy of the system, not because he broke the rules, but because he refused to believe they were real. He filed a formal declaration of harassment with the state's Department of Civil Enforcement. He requested protective monitoring. He requested anonymized inquiry dispatch. He activated an internal escalation protocol normally reserved for threats against state properties and personnel. The response was immediate. He was granted full documentation support, secure archiving, and a temporary liaison assigned to monitor incoming signals. But the most telling moment came during a follow-up interview with a retired infrastructure analyst who had lived in Sellers Creek for over a decade. She spoke quietly, off the record, and her words haunted him long after. "It's not just Karen," she said. "It's a dozen of them, maybe more. They started small, offering to coordinate empty homes while people traveled. Then they made the program. Then they punished anyone who didn't join. Some sold their homes just to get out. Others never knew they were being watched. You're not fighting one person. You're fighting an adopted language, a belief system. They've redefined community as control." Bryce asked why no one had spoken out. She only shook her head. Some did. They're gone now. And that was when he understood the final form of the escalation. It wasn't about him at all. It was about the message. Break one person's will loudly enough, and the rest would comply without being asked. Make the state commissioner kneel, and everyone else would fold by default. But Bryce didn't kneel. Instead, he prepared the one thing they hadn't expected, a formal regulatory injunction, backed by his office, signed off by his agency's general counsel, requesting a full criminal investigation into community misuse of property law and unauthorized occupation procedures under the guise of localized policy. He submitted it not to the board. He submitted it to the state, to the governor's office, to internal legal affairs. And within 48 hours, the game changed. The lights stayed on. The neighbors stopped walking. And Karen went silent. The silence that followed Bryce's submission of the injunction wasn't peaceful. It was tactical. He knew it from the first day the street emptied unnaturally early, from the sudden absence of joggers and dog walkers, from the lack of flyers or notices on his door. There was no acknowledgement, no confrontation, no retaliatory act. Instead, there was vacancy, intentional and loaded. They weren't retreating. They were recalibrating. He could feel it in the air, that suffocating stillness of a storm drawing breath. But Bryce didn't flinch. His office had confirmed receipt, the state liaison had opened an investigative file, and the governor's administrative team had escalated the matter to the Property Oversight Committee for formal review. That meant every move from this point forward would be observed, recorded, and, if necessary, prosecuted. The neighborhood board had no idea how close they were to a line they couldn't uncross. Then came the meeting. It wasn't publicized through normal channels, no posted flyers, no email updates, but one of Bryce's informants, a maintenance worker recently alienated by Karen's crew, left him an anonymous note. Wednesday, 7 p.m. Private session. District alignment discussion. It didn't say where, but Bryce knew. There was only one location in Sellers Creek where the board ever met behind closed doors. The former recreation center now repurposed into what they called the Commons Hub. On the surface, it was a neutral community space, but those who'd lived in the neighborhood long enough knew that real decisions were made behind its locked glass doors. Bryce didn't attend as a resident. He attended as an observer, quiet, distant, positioned behind the rear maintenance gate with a listening device calibrated to pick up conversation through layered walls. He didn't need video or confrontation. He only needed confirmation. What he captured was more than that. It was strategy. Inside, the voices spoke plainly, stripped of the fake language that usually coded their correspondence. One speaker, clearly Karen, laid out the threat plainly. If we don't get control back, the commissioner's report will trigger a freeze on the transitional program, and if that happens, we lose our leverage. We lose the whole model. Another voice suggested a workaround. We flag him. Public nuisance, dangerous behavior, maybe even mental instability. All we need is 3 written affidavits. Karen replied, "We'll get them. I already have 2. Bryce didn't move for several minutes after the recording ended. The plan wasn't to win legally. They couldn't. The plan was to discredit him, isolate him, and force the state to step back under the pretense of neutrality. They wanted to flip the narrative from unlawful targeting to necessary containment. That was the line they'd chosen, and now they were too deep to abandon it. Bryce returned home that night and filed a transcript of the meeting with the state attorney's office. He flagged the phrase model leverage and affidavit manufacturing as indicators of systemic abuse. He requested formally that an investigator be present within 72 hours. The response came back within a day. Approved. 2 nights later, the retaliation moved from planning to execution. Bryce received a knock at the door just past 9 p.m. He looked through the peephole and saw 2 sheriff's deputies. Their demeanor was calm, almost reluctant. One held a clipboard. The other carried a body camera. Bryce opened the door, silent. The deputy explained they were responding to a report of a domestic dispute, yelling, threats, potential damage. Bryce said nothing, just opened the door wider and gestured for them to look around. They did. There was no one else, no noise, no sign of struggle. After 15 minutes, they apologized and left. Bryce noted their names and badge numbers, uploaded the footage, and cross-referenced the complaint number through a contact in dispatch. The call had come from a blocked line, referencing his name specifically, describing behavior he'd never exhibited. The next day, 2 more complaints were filed, one citing an aggressive exchange with a neighbor, another alleging verbal threats made toward HOA personnel. Both were unsigned, submitted through anonymous online forms. But Bryce recognized the coordination. The affidavits Karen had promised were now manifesting. He could see the machinery spinning up, documents being fed into a system designed to erode credibility by attrition. It wasn't about evidence. It was about repetition. If they filed enough noise, eventually someone in the state would ask, "Why is this one man drawing so much conflict?" But Bryce had prepared for this too. He compiled every recorded interaction he'd had in the last 30 days, video, audio, digital logs. Then he issued a formal presentation to the Property Oversight Committee titled Targeted De-Legitimization of Statutory Authority by Community Fabrication. It was clean, brutal, and utterly damning. Within it, he included the transcript of Karen's private meeting, the fabricated utility forms, the gas line tampering footage, the doctored photos used for property citations, and the false sheriff's dispatch. The report was 38 pages, with 72 supporting exhibits. He submitted it. Then he waited. On the morning of the 6th week, the neighborhood awoke to something it hadn't seen in years. A black government SUV parked directly in front of Karen Elridge's house. 2 agents entered, one stayed outside. By noon, her personal files were removed. Her email server was taken offline. By sunset, a temporary administrator had been appointed, pending review of procedural inconsistencies. Bryce didn't gloat. He didn't speak. He didn't post or smile or deliver triumphant remarks to the neighbors who avoided his eyes as he walked past. He simply went home, opened the windows, and let the fresh air replace the artificial tension that had pressed against the walls of his house for over a month. There were no apologies, no acknowledgments, no admissions, but the lights no longer flickered. The mail arrived on time. The surveillance ended. And in that stillness, Bryce felt something he hadn't in weeks. Not victory, not vindication, but equilibrium. They had underestimated who they were dealing with. They had tried to rent the house of a man who could audit the entire system with a phone call. And now the model they built would be dismantled brick by bureaucratic brick, by one of their own. The neighborhood didn't change overnight, but the silence took on a new texture. No longer a weapon, but a response to loss. Sellers Creek, which once buzzed with passive-aggressive structure and covert supervision, now operated in a daze. Karen's removal sent a ripple far beyond her circle of collaborators. The hub was closed for infrastructure review. The Creek Stay program was suspended pending investigation, and the language of rotational occupancy disappeared entirely from local correspondence. The lawn signs vanished. Flyers were stripped from bulletin boards. The people who once moved with mechanical purpose now walked slowly, cautiously, as if waiting for another shoe to drop. Bryce watched it all from his front window with a quiet clarity, not reveling in the shift, but observing it like a man taking inventory of a battlefield after the dust has settled. There were no parades, no thank you notes, no closed-door apologies. The system didn't collapse with drama. It unraveled through silence, the way all fraudulent institutions do when light is finally thrown on their foundation. Bryce resumed his schedule with methodical precision. He still trimmed his hedges every Sunday, still walked the perimeter every third morning, still filed paperwork with timestamps and backups. But something inside him had shifted too. He no longer viewed the house as a temporary outpost or a strategic location. It had become personal. Not because he was attached to its walls or its layout, but because it had been the epicenter of a test, one that reached far beyond property lines and neighborly disputes. This was never about rent. It was about autonomy, about the slow, quiet erosion of authority through cooperative pressure. And now that he had stopped it, he had no intention of letting the mechanisms regroup. His injunction triggered a full audit of 5 other neighborhoods suspected of engaging in similar shadow governance tactics. His office, once considered distant from daily enforcement, was now tasked with issuing revised guidelines on residential program legality and public policy impersonation. Internally, they called it the Seller's Memo. Bryce didn't take credit. He didn't speak to the press. He declined interviews, ignored speculation, and avoided the State House completely for a month. But word spread. A letter arrived 2 weeks later, plain envelope, no return address. Inside was a single card, white stock, embossed text, unsigned, "We thought you were just another name. Won't happen again." No threat, no sarcasm, just recognition. Bryce folded the card and slid it into a drawer. He wouldn't forget it. The following month, a new tenant moved into the house across from him. Young couple, quiet, cautious. They nodded politely but didn't engage. Bryce saw their inspection papers delivered officially, watched the utility crews verify service lines twice, even noted a clerk from the tax assessor's office walking the property boundaries in person. It was overkill, but it was deliberate. A new standard had been set. He had become a precedent, not by choice, but by consequence. And yet, even in the aftermath, the system left its residue. One morning, a real estate agent knocked on his door, cheerful and oblivious, claiming the house had been flagged as transitional available on a now-defunct community platform. Bryce didn't raise his voice. He simply asked for the agent's license number, made a call, and within hours, that firm received a formal cease order from the state compliance unit. These were no longer isolated reactions. They were systemic corrections. And every time the old framework tried to breathe, it was choked off by the very machine it had tried to manipulate. Bryce didn't have to chase anyone. He'd already built the mechanism that would do it for him. On the 6-month mark, a courier delivered a certified package to his door. It contained the final closure notice of the Creek Stay model, officially condemned by state review. Enclosed was a list of impacted properties, names redacted, and an accompanying memo acknowledging Bryce's initial report as the catalyst. At the bottom, a single line. Systemic integrity often begins with an individual's refusal to look away. He left it on his desk, unopened for days, not out of indifference but because he knew what it meant. He had never intended to be noticed. He came to Sellers Creek to observe, to blend, to understand the practical application of policy in the hands of those who lived by it. What he found instead was a mirror, one that showed how easily power could bend perception, how structure could be faked if presented with enough confidence, and how even the most absurd mandates could become law in the absence of resistance. They had tried to turn his silence into participation, and when that failed, they tried to rewrite his presence as aggression, but in the end they had failed because they assumed he was just a name. He wasn't. He was the system they tried to copy, and he never left his post.